In the autumn darkness of 1944, when the liberation of Europe hung suspended between triumph and catastrophe, a profound psychological battle raged beneath the thunder of artillery and the mechanical grinding of tank treads. While history remembers the spectacular armored thrusts and the newsreel generals who commanded them, the Wehrmacht's most experienced field commanders harbored a deeper, more visceral dread of an adversary who moved with deliberate precision rather than theatrical rage. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, embodied a philosophy of warfare that proved more psychologically devastating to German defensive doctrine than any amount of aggressive bravado could achieve. His methodical approach to battle, characterized by overwhelming preparation, absolute certainty of logistical superiority, and an unshakable refusal to commit forces until victory was mathematically assured, created a form of psychological pressure that German commanders found impossible to counter. Unlike the flamboyant General George Smith Patton, whose Third Army swept across France with headline-generating speed, Montgomery approached each engagement as an engineer approaches a complex structural problem, measuring every variable, eliminating every uncertainty, and applying force only when failure became impossible. German intelligence officers studying Allied command patterns discovered something profoundly unsettling when Montgomery began his characteristic build-up of men and material along a particular sector of the front. No amount of tactical brilliance, no desperate counterattack, no 11th-hour reinforcement could prevent the inevitable collapse that followed. The psychological weight of this certainty, the knowledge that Montgomery would never attack until he possessed such overwhelming superiority that German defeat became not merely probable but unavoidable, created a form of despair that undermined morale more effectively than any sudden shock assault ever could. The European theatre of the Second World War, as it stood in the months following the Normandy invasion of June 1944, presented Allied commanders with a strategic dilemma of unprecedented complexity. The successful establishment of beachheads along the Norman coast had demonstrated American and British capacity for amphibious assault, but the subsequent campaign to liberate occupied Europe revealed profound disagreements regarding the proper application of military force. The doctrinal split that emerged between American preference for bold, rapid maneuver warfare and British emphasis on careful, methodical advance reflected not merely different national temperaments, but fundamentally incompatible philosophies regarding acceptable casualty rates and the relationship between operational speed and strategic certainty. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces, found himself mediating between subordinates whose approaches to warfare seemed almost irreconcilable. The American tradition, forged in the vast spaces of the Western frontier and refined through Civil War campaigns of annihilation, favored aggressive forward movement, acceptance of tactical risk, and faith in American industrial capacity to replace losses. The British tradition, shaped by centuries of imperial warfare, fought with limited manpower, and haunted by the catastrophic bloodletting of the First World War's Western Front, demanded conservation of irreplaceable trained soldiers and absolute certainty before major offensive operations. The strategic situation facing Allied forces in autumn 1944 appeared deceptively favorable. German armies, battered by years of attrition on the Eastern Front, and now pressed from both east and west, seemed on the verge of collapse. American commanders, particularly Patton, argued passionately for immediate exploitation of German weakness through rapid armored thrusts deep into enemy territory, cutting supply lines and bypassing defensive strongpoints in favor of speed. This philosophy promised swift victory and minimal time for German forces to reconstitute defensive lines. Yet Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces in the northern sector of the Allied advance, perceived dangers that his American counterparts dismissed. The German army, despite its strategic predicament, retained formidable defensive capabilities. German soldiers, fighting now on the borders of their homeland, demonstrated renewed determination. German defensive doctrine, perfected through years of Eastern Front fighting, emphasized elastic defense, mobile reserves, and devastating counterattacks against overextended salients. Most critically, the approaching winter threatened to transform the European landscape into terrain that heavily favored defenders over attackers. Montgomery recognized that hasty advances, unsupported by adequate logistics and vulnerable to German counterstrokes, risked catastrophic defeat that could prolong the war indefinitely. His insistence on methodical preparation, on building up overwhelming superiority before each major operation, reflected not timidity but profound understanding of modern warfare's industrial reality. Bernard Law Montgomery emerged from the carnage of the First World War with convictions that would shape his entire approach to military command. As a young officer serving on the Western Front, he witnessed firsthand the catastrophic consequences of poorly planned offensives launched without adequate preparation. The British Expeditionary Forces experience during the Somme Offensive of 1916, where tens of thousands of soldiers died on the first day alone, left an indelible mark on Montgomery's understanding of acceptable military practice. Unlike many officers of his generation who emerged from the trenches determined to avoid static warfare at any cost, Montgomery drew a different lesson, that casualties resulted not from methodical preparation but from its absence, that soldiers died not because attacks were too carefully planned, but because they were insufficiently supported. This philosophical foundation, controversial among more aggressive commanders, would define Montgomery's entire approach to Second World War operations. He refused absolutely to commit forces to battle until he possessed such overwhelming superiority in men, artillery, armor, and air support that victory became not merely probable but inevitable. This approach earned him criticism from American commanders, who viewed it as excessively cautious, even cowardly, but it also earned him something far more valuable, the absolute trust of the soldiers who served under his command, who understood that Montgomery would never expend their lives carelessly. Montgomery's personality, often described as arrogant and insufferable by fellow officers, reflected his unshakable confidence in his own methods. He cultivated a public image of eccentric certainty, wearing distinctive berets rather than regulation headgear, addressing troops directly in carefully staged morale-building exercises, and demonstrating complete indifference to the opinions of superiors when he believed his approach was correct. This theatrical self-confidence served a calculated purpose. It projected absolute certainty to both his own forces and to enemy commanders observing his preparations. When Montgomery announced his intention to attack a particular sector, German intelligence officers understood that the offensive would materialize exactly as Montgomery described, with precisely the overwhelming force he promised, at exactly the time he specified. This predictability, rather than representing a weakness, constituted a profound psychological weapon. German commanders facing Montgomery's advance could not console themselves with hope that British logistics would fail, that weather would intervene, or that Montgomery might change his plans. The certainty of Montgomery's approach eliminated the possibility of lucky escapes or tactical surprises that might disrupt British operations. German forces facing Montgomery understood that they would be attacked with mathematical precision, that the attack would be supported by artillery bombardments of unprecedented intensity, and that British infantry would advance only after every identified German defensive position had been systematically destroyed. This knowledge created a form of psychological pressure more demoralizing than any sudden shock assault could achieve. Montgomery's approach to military operations represented a systematic doctrine that could be understood almost as an engineering process rather than an art of war. Each major offensive followed an identical pattern, refined through experience, and applied with mechanical consistency. The first phase involved comprehensive intelligence gathering, utilizing aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, prisoner interrogation, and resistance reports to construct a complete picture of enemy dispositions, strength, and defensive preparations. Unlike commanders who relied on estimates and approximations, Montgomery insisted on precise information regarding every German unit, every defensive position, every supply route that might support enemy forces in the target sector. This intelligence-gathering phase often consumed weeks, frustrating American commanders who believed opportunities for exploitation were being squandered. The second phase involved logistical preparation of unprecedented scale. Montgomery's staff calculated exactly how many artillery shells would be required to neutralize identified German positions, how many tons of supplies would be needed to sustain the offensive, how many replacement troops would be necessary to maintain unit strength, and how many medical facilities would be required to handle anticipated casualties. These calculations were not approximate. Montgomery demanded precision in logistics matching the precision of his tactical planning. Supply dumps were established, ammunition stockpiles accumulated, and transport capacity allocated with mathematical exactitude. The third phase involved the positioning of overwhelming force. Montgomery refused to attack until he possessed numerical superiority of at least 3-1, preferably higher, in the specific sector where he intended to achieve breakthrough. This concentration of force required stripping other sectors of the front to near skeleton strength, a calculated risk that Montgomery considered acceptable, given his confidence that German forces, pinned by his offensive preparations, would lack the capacity to exploit weaknesses elsewhere. Artillery was massed in densities, unprecedented in Western Front operations, with gun concentrations exceeding even the massive bombardments of First World War set-piece battles. Tank units were positioned, infantry assault formations rehearsed their specific objectives, and air support was coordinated with ground operations, with meticulous attention to timing and target selection. The fourth and final phase was the attack itself, executed with inexorable momentum. Artillery bombardments, often lasting hours or even days, systematically destroyed German defensive positions. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages, clearing fortified positions with flamethrowers and explosive charges. Armor exploitation forces waited in reserve, committed only after infantry had achieved breakthrough and secured flanks. This methodical approach meant that Montgomery's offensives rarely achieved the spectacular breakthrough that characterized Patton's operations, but they also rarely failed. German commanders facing Montgomery's attacks understood that they were witnessing not a battle in the traditional sense, but an industrial process of systematic destruction that no amount of tactical skill or desperate courage could prevent. The autumn of 1944 presented Montgomery with both opportunity and vindication. His careful advance through Belgium and Holland had proceeded with characteristic methodical precision, liberating cities and securing ports while maintaining unbroken supply lines and avoiding overextension. Yet pressure mounted from American commanders and even from Churchill himself to accelerate the advance, to take risks that might shorten the war before winter. Montgomery, always confident in his own judgment, proposed an operation that seemed to contradict his usual caution, Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne assault intended to seize bridges across the Rhine River and open a corridor for rapid armored advance into Germany's industrial heartland. The operation, launched in mid-September 1944, would drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines to capture strategic bridges, while XX Corps, spearheaded by Guards Armored Division, drove northward along a single highway to link up with the airborne forces. The plan represented Montgomery's attempt to demonstrate that methodical preparation could support bold operational concepts, that careful planning and overwhelming force could achieve results matching American-style aggressive maneuver. German commanders, monitoring Allied dispositions along the Dutch border, recognized immediately the signature of Montgomery's preparations. The characteristic buildup of supplies, the massing of artillery, the concentration of armored formations, all indicated an impending offensive of Montgomery's usual overwhelming force. Yet the operational concept caught German intelligence completely off guard. Montgomery, the apostle of methodical certainty, was gambling on a complex airborne operation requiring precise timing, favorable weather, and rapid link-up across 64 miles of enemy-held territory. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the Netherlands, initially refused to believe intelligence reports suggesting such an ambitious plan. Model, veteran of years of Eastern Front combat and thoroughly familiar with Montgomery's cautious reputation, assumed that reports of airborne preparation represented deception, that Montgomery's actual offensive would follow his usual pattern of frontal assault with overwhelming force. When British and American paratroopers began landing throughout the Netherlands on September 17, Model experienced a moment of genuine shock. Predictable Montgomery had attempted an operation of breathtaking audacity. The subsequent battle for the Dutch bridges revealed both the strengths and limitations of Montgomery's approach. The airborne assault itself, executed with magnificent courage by British 1st Airborne Division American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions achieved initial success, capturing bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and critically, establishing a bridgehead at Arnhem on the northern bank of the Rhine. Yet the ground component of the operation, XX Corps' advance along the single highway, encountered German resistance that demonstrated the Wehrmacht's continued capacity for effective defensive action. German commanders, recovering from their initial surprise, recognized the vulnerability inherent in British reliance on a single axis of advance. Panzers and infantry blocked the highway, forcing XX Corps to fight through successive defensive positions while British paratroopers at Arnhem, isolated and surrounded, fought a desperate holding action. Montgomery, monitoring the operation from his headquarters, demonstrated his characteristic response to tactical setback. Rather than ordering desperate attacks to achieve breakthrough regardless of cost, he committed additional forces methodically, maintained supply flow to engaged units, and refused to escalate commitment beyond sustainable levels. When it became clear that relief of Arnhem could not be achieved before German forces overwhelmed the isolated paratroopers, Montgomery authorized withdrawal, accepting operational failure rather than compound losses through futile persistence. The psychological impact of Market Garden on German commanders proved more significant than the operation's tactical outcome. Montgomery, even in failure, had demonstrated that his methodical approach supported bold operational concepts, that his reputation for caution did not prevent him from attempting audacious maneuvers when circumstances warranted. German intelligence officers analyzing the operation recognized a disturbing implication. If Montgomery was willing to gamble on such an ambitious plan, what might he attempt with even more thorough preparation? The operation, despite its failure to achieve strategic objectives, reinforced German commanders' fear of Montgomery's capability for overwhelming force application. British casualties, while significant, remained far below the catastrophic losses that characterized poorly planned offensives. Montgomery had demonstrated that even his failures were controlled, measured, and sustainable, a fact that made him more dangerous, not less, in German strategic calculations. The months following Market Garden witnessed Montgomery's methodical approach applied to the grinding campaign of winter warfare. As Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, German commanders facing Montgomery's 21st Army Group experienced the full psychological weight of his systematic doctrine. Unlike sectors facing American forces, where German commanders could hope for opportunities created by American aggression and occasional overextension, sectors facing Montgomery offered no such consolation. The characteristic pattern of Montgomery's offensives, weeks of visible preparation, massive accumulation of supplies, concentration of artillery in unmistakable densities, created a psychological pressure that proved devastating to German morale. German soldiers watching British preparations understood exactly what was coming: overwhelming bombardment, methodical infantry advance supported by armor and air power, and inevitable retreat or annihilation. This certainty, this absolute knowledge that defense was futile, undermined fighting spirit more effectively than sudden shock attacks ever could. The Reichswald Forest Campaign of February 1945 demonstrated Montgomery's doctrine in its purest form. Facing German defensive positions in the forested terrain along the German-Dutch border, Montgomery refused to commit forces until he had assembled overwhelming superiority. British and Canadian forces massed artillery in densities exceeding 1 gun for every 13 yards of front, an unprecedented concentration of firepower. Infantry divisions rehearsed specific objectives, tank units were positioned for exploitation, and logistical preparations ensured that ammunition, fuel, and supplies would flow without interruption. German commanders observing these preparations experienced despair born of certainty. They knew, with mathematical precision, that when Montgomery's offensive began, their defensive lines would be systematically destroyed regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. When the bombardment commenced on February 8, 1945, it continued for hours, reducing German positions to shattered moonscapes where survival itself became impossible. British and Canadian infantry advanced through the devastation, clearing remaining resistance with flamethrowers and explosive charges, while German survivors retreated or surrendered, psychologically broken not by sudden shock, but by the inexorable certainty of Montgomery's industrial approach to warfare. The Rhine crossing operations of March 1945 represented Montgomery's methodical approach at its most elaborate. While American forces further south achieved surprise crossings with minimal preparation, Montgomery insisted on building up overwhelming force before attempting the assault. For weeks, supplies accumulated, artillery positions were prepared, assault boats were stockpiled, and smokescreens were tested. German commanders watching these preparations understood that when Montgomery finally ordered the assault, it would be supported by such overwhelming force that German defenders would face certain annihilation. This psychological pressure, this knowledge of inevitable defeat, caused German morale to collapse even before British forces entered the water. When Operation Plunder commenced on March 23, 1945, it proceeded with mechanical precision, British and Canadian forces crossing the Rhine against disorganized resistance, suffering minimal casualties, and establishing bridgeheads that could not be dislodged. The contrast between Montgomery's methodical success and the higher casualties suffered by American forces, achieving surprise crossings, vindicated his approach. German commanders, analyzing post-war after-action reports, acknowledged that Montgomery's offensives, while predictable and slow, proved ultimately more devastating than American-style aggressive maneuver because they eliminated hope, destroyed morale, and created psychological conditions where resistance seemed futile. The final campaigns through northern Germany demonstrated how completely Montgomery's psychological dominance had been established. German units facing 21st Army groups surrendered in unprecedented numbers, not because they lacked ammunition or equipment, but because they recognized the futility of resistance. Montgomery's reputation, his absolute certainty, his refusal to attack until victory was assured, these psychological factors proved as destructive as any physical weapon. German commanders, accustomed to fighting desperate defensive battles against Soviet forces in the East, where tactical skill and desperate courage occasionally created opportunities for survival, found no such possibilities facing Montgomery. The certainty of British preparations, the overwhelming force applied to each objective, the mechanical inevitability of Montgomery's advance, these factors created a form of psychological defeat that preceded physical combat. The conclusion of European hostilities brought extensive analysis of command effectiveness, tactical doctrine, and the psychological dimensions of modern warfare. While popular histories often celebrated aggressive commanders whose operations generated dramatic headlines, military professionals studying campaign effectiveness recognized Montgomery's methodical approach as profoundly influential. Soviet commanders, analyzing Western Allied operations, noted the psychological effectiveness of Montgomery's certainty, his ability to break enemy morale through overwhelming preparation rather than shock action. American doctrine, while retaining its emphasis on aggressive maneuver, incorporated elements of Montgomery's systematic approach, particularly regarding logistical preparation and concentration of force at decisive points. British military education institutions established Montgomery's campaigns as case studies in the relationship between operational planning and psychological warfare, demonstrating how certainty and overwhelming force could achieve strategic results exceeding those obtained through tactical brilliance alone. German military memoirs published in subsequent decades revealed the profound psychological impact Montgomery's approach had created. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt in post-war interrogations acknowledged that Montgomery's predictability actually enhanced his effectiveness rather than diminishing it, because the certainty of British preparations eliminated German hope for tactical opportunities that might disrupt offensive operations. German commanders described a unique form of psychological pressure when facing Montgomery's forces, not the adrenaline-fueled terror of sudden attack, but a grinding despair born of mathematical certainty, knowledge that regardless of individual skill or courage, British overwhelming force would eventually prevail. This psychological dimension of Montgomery's doctrine proved particularly significant in understanding modern warfare's industrial character, where material superiority and logistical depth often determined outcomes more decisively than tactical innovation or individual heroism. The contrast between Montgomery's reputation among fellow commanders and his effectiveness against enemy forces revealed profound truths regarding military psychology. While American commanders often found Montgomery insufferable, excessively cautious, and frustratingly slow, German commanders feared him precisely because of these characteristics. Montgomery's refusal to gamble, his insistence on overwhelming preparation, his absolute certainty that he would never commit forces until victory was assured, these traits created psychological pressure that aggressive, unpredictable commanders could not duplicate. German defensive doctrine, refined through years of Eastern Front combat, emphasized elastic defense, mobile reserves, and counterattacks against overextended salients. These defensive methods proved highly effective against aggressive commanders who created exploitable vulnerabilities through rapid advance. Against Montgomery, whose advances never outran logistics and whose flanks were always secured before forward movement resumed, German defensive doctrine found no purchase. The psychological impact of facing an enemy whose operations proceeded with mechanical inevitability, whose preparations were so thorough that tactical surprises became impossible, proved more devastating than any amount of aggressive shock action. The historical evaluation of Montgomery's command reveals profound lessons regarding the nature of military effectiveness and the relationship between personality, doctrine, and psychological warfare. While popular memory often celebrates bold, aggressive commanders whose operations generated dramatic narratives suitable for entertainment, professional military analysis recognizes that Montgomery's methodical approach represented a sophisticated understanding of modern warfare's industrial character. The psychological weapon Montgomery wielded, certainty itself, the elimination of hope, the creation of conditions where enemy resistance became mathematically futile, proved devastatingly effective against an experienced professional enemy army. German commanders, who had fought brilliantly against Soviet forces in the East and had contained American advances through tactical skill, found themselves psychologically defeated by Montgomery's refusal to provide tactical opportunities, his absolute insistence on overwhelming preparation, and his mechanical certainty that every offensive would proceed exactly as planned. The broader implications of Montgomery's approach extend beyond World War II historical analysis to fundamental questions regarding military philosophy and acceptable approaches to armed conflict. Montgomery's doctrine, rooted in his First World War experiences and his determination to avoid unnecessary casualties, represented an ethical stance regarding the expenditure of soldiers' lives. His refusal to attack until overwhelming superiority was assured, while criticized as excessively cautious by aggressive commanders, reflected a moral calculation that soldiers' lives should not be risked carelessly, that commanders bore ethical responsibility to ensure that attacks had every possible advantage before committing men to combat. This ethical dimension of Montgomery's approach, often overlooked in purely tactical analyses, explains the fierce loyalty he inspired among soldiers who served under his command, and the equally fierce criticism he received from commanders who prioritized operational speed over casualty minimization. The enduring relevance of Montgomery's psychological dominance lies in its demonstration that warfare's psychological dimensions can prove as decisive as physical force. The fear German commanders felt when observing Montgomery's preparations, not sudden terror but grinding certainty of inevitable defeat, represents a form of psychological warfare distinct from shock action or deception. Montgomery weaponized predictability itself, transforming his reputation for methodical caution into a psychological tool that broke enemy morale before physical combat commenced. This approach to warfare, emphasizing certainty over surprise, overwhelming force over tactical cleverness, and psychological preparation over shock action, offers lessons that remain relevant to military professionals studying the art of command. In the final analysis, German commanders feared Montgomery's calm more than Patton's fury because calm represented something far more terrifying than anger. It represented absolute confidence born of overwhelming preparation, mathematical certainty of victory, and the elimination of all hope that tactical skill might create opportunities for survival. Against such certainty, courage itself became insufficient, and the psychological foundations of resistance crumbled before physical defeat was accomplished.